be assertive and do some jumping jacks and get loose up here. So, I guess you can start timing me now. My talk is going to be about equality. Is inequality inextricably human? Meaning, are we programmed to have ranking? Are we programmed to have hierarchy built into our societies? Or should we really fight against it, fight against that grain, and say that we should fight for equality? Is that something we should strive for? In answering this question, I'm going to meander a little bit. I'm going to first talk to you about what social hierarchies are. Then I'm going to talk to you about caste in India. And lastly, I'm going to talk to you about what these markers are for equality and whether it's important to focus on the markers or to really look at equality as the goal. So first and foremost, what is social hierarchy? Social hierarchy is basically ranking that determines the power and influence people have. Meaning, in our society, we determine hierarchy by capital. If you have capital, you're at the top. If you don't have capital, you find yourself at the bottom. But there's also other markers, right? You have gender, disability, you have race, you have other markers that determine what hierarchy you belong into. In India, one of these markers is caste. And the caste system is something unique for most of us in the West. The caste system is a social hierarchy that predetermines where you belong in society by your birth. Just by what family you're born into will determine for life where you're going to be in society. And really the essence of it has to do with ritual pollution. And ritual pollution is if your family's occupation was a certain job, the status that goes along with that is what you carried for life. Now let me give you a couple of examples. Let's say historically your family were latrine cleaners, meaning bathroom cleaners, right? You're one of the lowest castes in India. You're considered to be what's called an untouchable. So if you were an untouchable, if you came into the presence of people that were higher caste, you would cover your mouth and cover yourself so that you wouldn't pollute the air that these other high caste people are breathing. And you'd have to maintain a certain proximity to keep the distance away from them. Now it's not just that issue about proximity, but it also is about who you can associate with. You wouldn't be able to associate with people from a higher caste. You wouldn't be able to eat with them, socialize with them, or even work anywhere around them. You have a completely different life from these people. Even in death, you would have to be buried or cremated in a different place from these people that are higher caste, because your presence, even in death, is polluting. And it's almost unimaginable for us in the West, but in order to understand it, let me give you another example. The second example is when I was studying in India, I was doing my field work there, and I was looking at a church that was set up by the London Missionary Society back in the 18th century. And the missionaries were well-intentioned. They wanted to eradicate caste. They wanted to have all men or women as equals in Christianity. That was their goal. So I would attend this church, and I would sit towards the back, and then I would leave after the service was done. I would speak to some of the people. On one such Sunday, the secretary of the church came and asked me, sort of ascertained who my family was, where I was from, what I was doing there. And once he figured out who I was, who my grandparents were, he told me, he said, our people sit in the first 13 rows of this church. So the next time you come, please make sure you sit in those first 13 rows. And I remember writing in my journal that night that 300 years after the missionaries set up this church to get rid of caste, here I was being told to sit in the first 13 rows so that the people behind us wouldn't pollute me. It's unimaginable for us to think about that. But why am I talking to you about social hierarchy and caste in India? Why is that important for us? Frankly, it's not. What is important is that we're able to identify as in our society what the markers and divisions are that create disparities or inequalities. Now, it's not to say that, hey, you know, African Americans, white, Latino, disabled, female, male, upper class, lower class, middle class, that, you know, one group is responsible for the other group's, you know, troubles. That's not the point of this. In fact, it's quite the opposite. It's not about pointing fingers and saying, hey, you need to be responsible for this. What the point is the markers are what's important. Let me give you a quick example. When I was finishing up my education, I had gone to Mexico and I studied Spanish, and I thought that was going to be important for me as a lawyer because I'd be representing Latinos and, you know, figuring out things for La Raza. You know, I was like ready to go. And I'm not Latino, but I thought in Southern California that's important. Well, in my practice, it turns out that most of the cases that I deal with Latinos are against Latinos because they're discriminating against other people because they're the dominant group in the workforce. I have learned words like mayate, all these different chilango, all the different categories of words that Mexicanos use for Central Americans and for white folks. I mean, it's quite different than what I thought I was going to be doing. I thought I'd be representing a lot of women against men for sexual harassment cases. I'm actually representing quite a few men against female superiors. So it's not about, you know, saying, hey, we need to get it all equal. It's really about figuring out what the markers are that create these divisions in our society and being able to work on those disparities. So that's why the focus shouldn't be on equality. It really should be on identifying what these markers are that create divisions in our society. Thank you.